Clara Bennett sat at her kitchen table, the early Oregon light slanting across the wood like pale ribbons. At 59, she had lived through more than enough storms to know how to steady herself in quiet mornings. A steaming mug of coffee sat beside her laptop, and for once, she felt a rare hush. She had worked as an office manager at a law firm for nearly 20 years, raised 2 children alone after her husband's sudden death, and carved out a life of steady rhythms. That morning, she opened her inbox expecting routine work emails and bills. But there it was, one unread message from her daughter, Sophie. No subject line, just her name. Clara smiled faintly as she clicked. She assumed it might be an update about wedding plans. A few weeks ago, Sophie had called, buzzing with excitement about her Napa Valley ceremony. Clara had already wired $30,000 to help book the vineyard venue, secure the photographer, and pay a deposit to the florist Sophie adored since college. She thought this email might be a thank you or maybe a quick love you, Mom. Instead, what she read felt like a blade drawn slow. Mom, it began. Not dear Mom. Just Mom, cold as an invoice. Sophie explained that after finalizing the guest list with her fiancé, Noah, and his parents, they had decided Clara should watch the wedding through a live stream. Clara reread it 3 times, as if the words might soften if given a chance. Sophie wrote that Noah's mother was very particular about guest numbers and wanted to keep it intimate. Then came the line that hollowed Clara out completely. If you want to be part of it, you can watch through the Google Meet link. Should be just like being there. LOL. Clara's coffee cooled beside her hand. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. Something inside her shifted quietly, like a fault line cracking deep underground. She typed 4 words in reply. Sure. Enjoy your big day. She stared at the screen for a moment longer, then closed the laptop. There were no theatrics, no slamming of mugs or broken sobs. Just the sound of her chair scraping softly as she stood. She poured the cold coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and placed it gently upside down in the drying rack. Then she got dressed for work like it was any other Tuesday. Only it wasn't. This was the day she realized that all her sacrifices might have meant nothing to her daughter. This is the day, Clara whispered to her reflection as she buttoned her blouse. Everything changes. The drive to the office was silent. Oregon's early spring air still held a bite, but Clara barely noticed. Her mind kept circling the same question. How had they gotten here? She had spent 18 years at Caldwell and Walker Law, not glamorous work but solid. After her husband's heart attack left her widowed with 2 teenagers, stability had been her only priority. She remembered standing in their tiny laundry room, bills spread across the counter like battlefield maps, trying to decide whether to buy groceries or pay Sophie's college deposit. She chose Sophie. She always had. Clara gave up her weekends back then. She picked up extra shifts, canceled vacations, and learned to celebrate birthdays with a store-bought cake eaten between overtime spreadsheets. "There'll be time for me later," she used to whisper while folding towels at midnight. But later never came. Every spare penny went to Sophie and Ethan. When Sophie changed majors twice and needed more credits, Clara paid. When Sophie moved across the country for a short-lived job in New York, Clara covered the deposit and the plane ticket. Love, she thought back then, meant never keeping score. She had flown across the country to hold Sophie after a brutal breakup, making tea in a kitchen that smelled nothing like home. When Ethan wanted to buy a house with his fiancée, Clara co-signed a mortgage and handed over a $10,000 check without hesitation. She never asked for repayment. She never even asked for gratitude. That's what mothers do, she often told herself. But Sophie's email had made her feel like a transaction, like she had been useful, and now she wasn't. Like she had a shelf life, and it had quietly expired without her noticing. At the office, her boss, Mr. Hayes, stopped by her desk. He was one of those rare men who remembered birthdays and how you like your coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said gently, setting a latte from the cafe downstairs on her desk. Clara forced a small smile. Didn't sleep well. He didn't press further. That simple kindness, the coffee, the silence, nearly undid her. After the noise in her head all morning, it reminded her that she still existed, that she still mattered, even if only quietly. Around lunch, her phone buzzed with Sophie's name flashing across the screen like a warning light. Voicemails. Texts. Mom, please answer. We need to talk. This isn't funny. Clara didn't open any of them. Not yet. She sipped the latte slowly, watching a sunbeam crawl across her desk. Maybe, she thought, it was time to stop being the one who always answered. Maybe it was time to stop playing a role in someone else's story when they wouldn't even let her on the stage. That afternoon, Clara made a quiet, radical decision. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to beg. She would do something far more powerful. She would act. After work, instead of heading home, she drove to First Federal Bank, just a few blocks from the office. Mr. Alvarez, the branch manager, had helped her for years. College funds, retirement adjustments, everything. He rose when he saw her walk in. Mrs. Bennett, he greeted warmly. What can I do for you today? Clara set her purse on the floor and said evenly, I need to cancel a wire transfer. Mr. Alvarez blinked. The one to the Napa venue? Yes, Clara said, her tone calm, almost serene. He hesitated, fingers hovering over his keyboard. There might be a cancellation fee, depending on the timing. May I ask why? The circumstances have changed, she replied, offering no more. He tapped a few keys, then looked up at her with raised brows. You're in luck. It hasn't processed yet, just in time. He paused, studying her. Are you sure, Mrs. Bennett? $50,000 is a significant amount. Clara nodded slowly. I'm sure. That was the amount she had planned to send next, on top of the $30,000 already gone. $80,000 for a wedding she was not welcome at. She signed the forms with steady hands and walked out of the bank without a single backward glance. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her phone was vibrating like an alarm. 9 missed calls from Sophie. 2 from Ethan. 1 voicemail simply said, Mom, please don't do this. Clara turned the phone off. In the kitchen, she reached for the bottle of red wine she had been saving for Thanksgiving, the one she never opened because Sophie canceled that visit last minute. Work, she had said. Clara poured a glass and carried it out to the porch. The evening air was soft and cool, birds chirping, a neighbor's dog barking faintly. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. As she sipped, memories rose like ghosts. Birthdays she had planned alone. Holidays where she pretended she wasn't waiting for a call that never came. The new shoes she didn't buy, the car she drove for 14 years, the vacation she postponed without complaint. Sophie's entire adult life had been cushioned by Clara's invisible sacrifices. And now, Noah's mother, who barely knew Sophie, had more say in Sophie's wedding than the woman who had carried her through every hard season. Clara thought about Sophie ending her email with LOL, as if watching her only daughter marry through a screen was a joke. She thought about herself, not as a mother, not as a widow, but as a woman. What did she want? Peace, dignity, a life that didn't orbit around being useful to people who only appeared when they needed something. She took another slow sip of wine and let the sunset bleed across the rooftops. The house was still. The stillness felt new, like standing in a room she had never noticed inside her own soul. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. Clara considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there. He still wore his office clothes, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. He held his phone like a shield. Mom, he said quickly, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. Why aren't you answering your phone? Sophie's freaking out. Hello to you, too, Clara replied, shutting the door with deliberate calm. He sighed, already pacing. She says you're not coming to the wedding now, that you're being difficult. Clara laughed once low. Difficult? For not attending a wedding I was uninvited from. Ethan stopped pacing. Andrew's parents are footing most of the bill, Mom. You know how traditional they are. Traditional, Clara echoed, raising an eyebrow. I already paid $30,000. I was about to give $50,000 more. That's not tradition. That's business. He froze. Wait, you were sending another 50? Clara said, taking a measured sip of wine, but not anymore. Ethan's face paled. Mom, they're counting on that. The venue, the food, not my problem anymore, she interrupted gently. His voice sharpened. Of course it's your problem. She's your daughter. And I'm her mother, Clara said softly. A mother who was told to stay home and watch from a screen. Ethan's jaw tightened. You always make everything about yourself. And that was it. The words cracked something deep inside her, something that had held for decades. Get out of my house, she said. Ethan blinked. What? You heard me. Get out. Mom. No, Clara said, voice steady but not loud. I've given everything I had, and I'm done being the villain in a story I wrote with love. For a second, Ethan just stood there, stunned. Then he turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, softly, but it sounded louder than any slam. Clara stayed, standing in the middle of her living room, heart pounding, hands still. She waited for guilt to come. It didn't. What she felt instead was startling and clean. She felt free. The next morning, Clara woke to 43 missed calls and a flood of messages from Sophie. They began with guilt-laced scolding. Mom, we need to talk. Why are you doing this? This is childish. Then they turned frantic. The venue called. The payment didn't go through. We'll lose everything if we don't pay by tomorrow. Noah's parents are furious. They said this proves they were right about you. At 3:24 a.m., Sophie had written, I don't understand why you're doing this to me. Clara smiled faintly into her coffee. Of course Sophie didn't understand. Sophie had grown up wrapped in Clara's sacrifices so tightly she had never thought to question where the comfort came from, the security, the safety net that always caught her. She assumed it would always be there. She assumed Clara would always be there. But not this time. Later that morning, while Clara was reviewing contracts at her desk, another email popped up. Subject, please don't ruin my wedding. Clara opened it without expectation, eyes steady, heart quiet. She was done being currency in her own child's life. Mom, the email began, I know you're upset about the livestream situation, but this is extreme. We've lost the venue deposit, and if we don't pay the remaining balance by the end of the day Paris time, the caterer walks. Noah's parents are beyond upset. They're saying this proves you can't be reasoned with. Please don't do this. We can talk about you attending the ceremony, but we need the funds first. Clara sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. There it was, not an apology, not reflection, just negotiation. They were suddenly willing to discuss her attending only because the money had vanished. As if her presence at her own daughter's wedding could be bartered. As if love came with a price tag. She closed the email and turned back to her work without replying. Her hands were steady. Her chest felt strangely light. Around noon, Mr. Hayes appeared at her cubicle with a warm smile. Lunch, he asked. That new Italian place just opened down the block. Normally, Clara would have declined politely, claiming paperwork. But something in her had shifted. Maybe it was the silence after decades of noise. Maybe it was realizing she didn't have to keep proving her worth. I'd like that, she said softly. They walked together beneath budding cherry trees, and Clara felt the air tasting different, cleaner somehow. Over pasta, Mr. Hayes told her stories about his grandkids, how exhausting and beautiful it was chasing them around. His eyes were soft, real. Then he paused, studying her with quiet concern. Forgive me, Clara, he said gently, but you seem lighter today. Clara surprised herself. She told him everything. About Sophie, the email, the money, and what she had done. Mr. Hayes didn't interrupt, didn't judge. When she finished, he only nodded slowly and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Sometimes the hardest part of love is setting boundaries, he said, especially with the people we've given the most to. His words sank deep, deeper than she expected. For the first time in years, Clara felt something like belief in herself flicker back to life. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me, she said quietly. When Clara returned to her desk, there were more calls, more texts, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. For the first time, her silence spoke louder than any defense could. That evening, when she pulled into her driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. The neighborhood was still, peaceful even, but there was someone sitting on her front steps. Clara slowed the car, squinting through the dusky light. As she got closer, recognition tugged at her. It was Lila. Lila had been Sophie's best friend since 5th grade. Sleepovers, baking cookies, giggling in sleeping bags until dawn. Clara hadn't seen her in years. Lila stood quickly as Clara approached, brushing invisible lint off her coat. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, "I'm sorry to drop by like this." "It's fine," Clara said, unlocking the door. "Would you like some tea?" They walked into the kitchen together, the familiar walls echoing with old memories. Clara filled the kettle and waited, feeling Lila's eyes on her. "Emily sent you?" she finally asked. Lila didn't answer right away. Then she sighed. "She's a mess. They lost the venue. The florist dropped out. Noah's parents are threatening to cancel the wedding altogether." Clara stayed silent, placing 2 mugs on the counter with care. "She's panicking," Lila went on. "She knows she messed up. She just doesn't know how to fix it. Is that why you're here?" Clara asked. "To fix it?" Lila shook her head. "No, I'm here to ask, is there anything she can say or do to change her mind?" Clara paused. The kettle hissed softly. She thought of that email, of all the years before it, of her own silence bleeding into the bones of her life. Was there anything? She murmured to herself. Would an apology change the way it felt? Clara said at last. To be excluded. To be used like a bank account? To be told you're not welcome unless your money is? Lila watched her, wide-eyed and quiet. "No," Clara said finally, voice calm. "There isn't." Lila's shoulders slumped. "Not even if she apologizes?" "Words are easy," Clara said gently, handing her a mug of tea, "especially when people are desperate." "The people who love you," Clara added, "they don't wait until you cut them off to finally see you." Lila looked down into her tea, nodding slowly. "I get it," she whispered, "even if she doesn't. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett." "You don't need to be," Clara replied. They stood in silence, 2 women from different generations connected by one hard truth. Sometimes love has limits. Sometimes the only way to be seen is to walk away. Lila didn't stay long. She didn't argue or plead. She just set her empty mug down gently on the counter. "Thank you for listening," she said. "Thank you for coming," Clara replied. Lila hugged her softly, like she was afraid Clara might shatter, then turned and slipped into the night. The door clicked shut behind her. For a long time, Clara stood there in the quiet kitchen, her hands wrapped around the cooling ceramic of her own mug. Something inside her felt finished. Not broken, not angry, just done. She walked through the dim house, turning off lights one by one, the silence following her like a new companion. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlight spilling across the carpet. For years, she had been tethered to Sophie's storms, her breakups, her triumphs, her chaos. Clara had mistaken proximity for love. But what she felt now wasn't love ending. It was love taking a different shape, one that didn't demand her blood to keep breathing. She lay down, and for the first time in months, sleep came quickly and without dreams. The wedding never happened, not as they planned anyway. Clara heard through Ethan weeks later that they scrambled to find another venue, but everything was either fully booked or far too expensive without the money she had once promised. They eventually held a small backyard ceremony. Just Noah's parents, a few distant relatives, and a friend who knew how to work a Bluetooth speaker. Clara wasn't invited, and this time, she didn't need to be. She spent the day in her garden, hands deep in the soil, humming to herself as bees drifted lazily through the lavender. Days turned into weeks. Sophie sent one more email, long and tangled, half apology, half justification. Clara read it once, then archived it. She didn't feel anger anymore, just distance, like hearing the echo of a train she had no intention of chasing. There was a strange peace in letting go, not with rage, but with clarity. It was like setting down a suitcase she hadn't realized she was carrying, her spine slowly straightening beneath its absence. She made a new rule for herself. If her presence was negotiable, then so was her effort. She no longer woke wondering who needed something from her. She stopped bracing for guilt disguised as love. Instead, she started rebuilding a life that belonged to her. She went to work. She read novels. She joined a pottery class on Thursday nights. Slowly, her evenings filled with laughter again, the soft, unforced kind that came from being around people who saw her as a person, not as a purse. Ethan visited once during those weeks, hesitant and quieter than before. He stood on her porch like a boy again, hands shoved in his pockets. "Mom," he said, "Sophie's still mad. But I get it now. What you did." Clara studied his face, the exhaustion, the guilt, the flicker of understanding, and felt a pang of tenderness. "You don't need to take sides," she told him. "I'm not," Ethan replied softly. "I just don't want to lose you two." "You won't," she said gently, and she meant it. After he left, Clara sat on the porch as the sun bled down the horizon, crickets beginning their nighttime choir. She thought about the decades she had spent building bridges for others to walk across. This time, she had stepped off the bridge herself, and it hadn't collapsed without her. That realization felt powerful, liberating in a quiet, almost sacred way. She poured herself a small glass of wine, toasted the twilight, and whispered to peace. At work, people began noticing something different about her. She laughed more. She lingered at lunch. She didn't apologize when she left on time. Even Mr. Hayes commented one Friday afternoon, "You seem lighter, Clara." "Maybe I am," she said. It wasn't that her life had suddenly filled with fireworks or wild adventure. It was simpler than that. For the first time in decades, she was living a life that wasn't shaped around someone else's expectations. And that, she realized, was its own quiet kind of joy. She started making small, daring changes. She bought herself new shoes, not sensible office flats, but deep red heels that made her stand taller. She booked a weekend trip to the coast with an old college friend, something she would have once called impractical. She even let herself browse the art section at the bookstore, running her fingers across the spines of heavy, beautiful things that served no purpose except to make her happy. It felt strange at first, then felt like breathing. One evening, after her pottery class, Clara sat in her car, watching the streetlights hum awake one by one. She realized she wasn't lonely. She was simply alone. There was a difference, one that tasted like freedom instead of grief. For so long, she had believed her worth lived in how much she gave, how empty she could make herself for others to fill. But now, she was learning something softer, truer. You don't have to burn yourself to keep others warm. And for the first time, she finally believed it. Saturday mornings became Clara's favorite part of the week. She no longer filled them with errands for other people or obligations she dreaded. Instead, she lingered in bed with the window cracked open, listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes she went to the farmer's market and bought herself fresh flowers, yellow tulips always. Sometimes she drove with no destination, letting the radio choose her mood. It was quiet happiness, the kind that didn't need permission, the kind that felt wholly her own. One Saturday, as she was choosing apples at the market, she heard her name. "Mrs. Bennett." Clara turned. It was Lila again, carrying a bag of oranges. She looked sheepish. "Lila," Clara said warmly. "How are you?" "I'm okay," Lila replied. Well, she's not okay. She keeps saying she doesn't understand why you did it." Clara picked another apple, turning it in her hand. "That's because she never saw what it cost me to always be the one holding everything together." Lila nodded slowly. "I think she's starting to." They stood there between stalls of honey jars and baked bread. Lila hesitated, then said, "I think she misses you." "She won't say it, but I can tell." Clara smiled softly. "Missing someone isn't the same as respecting them." "I know," Lila said quietly. "Still," Clara added, "I hope she finds peace, even if it's without me." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a calm acceptance, like watching the tide pull something away you were never meant to keep. In the weeks that followed, Clara kept reshaping her life. She painted her bedroom pale sage, a color that caught morning light like a whisper. She donated boxes of things she had kept only because they reminded her of who she used to be, a role she no longer wanted to audition for. The house grew emptier but warmer, less a museum of sacrifice and more a sanctuary of her own choosing. She realized she could let go of things without losing herself. Sometimes at night, she still thought of Sophie as a little girl, hair in crooked pigtails, sticky with popsicle juice, running barefoot across the lawn shouting, "Mommy, watch me." That memory still made her chest ache. But she had learned that love could remain even after obligation was gone. She could love Sophie without abandoning herself. That was the difference now. She didn't carry her daughter anymore. She simply wished her well from afar, and that was enough. At the office, Clara thrived in ways she hadn't expected. Freed from the weight of invisible guilt, she tackled projects with quiet focus. Mr. Hayes noticed. "You seem like someone who just remembered she's allowed to be happy," he told her one afternoon. "Maybe I am," she said, smiling. She had stopped shrinking herself to fit into other people's stories. She was finally writing her own, one where she didn't disappear in the background of everyone else's lives. One Thursday, as she left the building, Mr. Hayes caught up to her. "Clara," he said, "a few of us are going to that jazz place on 5th tomorrow night. You should come." The old Clara would have declined with a polite excuse. This Clara paused, then said, "You know what? I will." Mr. Hayes beamed. "Good. I'll save you a seat." As she walked to her car, Clara realized she was smiling, an unguarded, effortless smile she hadn't felt in years. The jazz night was small and glowing, fairy lights strung overhead like stars caught on a wire. Clara sat at the table with her colleagues, tapping her fingers softly to the music. She wasn't anyone's mother or savior there. Just Clara, just herself, and it felt enough. More than enough. When the saxophone wailed a low, soulful note, she closed her eyes and let it sink into her bones like sunlight. She hadn't known life could feel this light. Driving home, the streets quiet and silver in the moonlight, Clara thought about how far she had come. Months ago, she would have been on the phone, smoothing over Sophie's crises, staying up until dawn to fix what wasn't hers to fix. Now, her phone was silent in her bag, and for once so was her mind. Peace didn't roar like triumph, she realized. It whispered. It crept in gently once you stopped chasing people who never turn around. She parked, stepped out into the cool night air, and stood still on her porch. Above her, the stars burned softly like distant lanterns. She felt no ache, no hollow, just quiet. Inside, the house waited warm and still. Clara turned the key, smiling faintly as the lock clicked open. She was home, not just inside her house, but inside herself. And for the first time in decades, that was all she needed. She whispered into the silence, "I'm finally free." Sunday morning arrived slow and golden. Clara woke before her alarm, sunlight spilling across her pillow. She lay there for a long time, listening to the soft creaks of the house, the distant coo of a mourning dove. For years, mornings had meant rushing, packing lunches, paying bills, putting out invisible fires before anyone noticed the smoke. Now, she lingered. There was no panic, no list. Just breath. Just her. She smiled into the quiet, realizing how rare it was to feel safe inside her own life. Later, she made blueberry pancakes, humming to an old song on the radio. The kitchen filled with the smell of vanilla and brown butter. It felt almost ceremonial, this act of cooking just for herself. She plated them carefully, sat at the table, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. She thought about how many meals she had eaten standing at counters, answering calls, solving problems that weren't hers. This was different. This was hers, and it tasted like freedom. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ethan. "Ethan, morning, Mom. Hope you're okay. Thinking of you." Clara smiled and replied simply, "I am. Thank you." It was the truth. Ethan didn't press for more, and she was grateful. Their relationship was healing gently, not forced, not rushed, just honest. She could love him without being consumed by him. It felt like tending a garden, patient and slow, knowing new growth comes when the soil is finally allowed to rest. She spent the afternoon in her garden, knees in the dirt, sun warming her back. Tiny green shoots peeked from the soil where she had planted lavender. Clara brushed a fingertip across their fragile leaves. She had once believed her worth came from how much she could give away. Now she understood. Her worth had always been hers. Not something earned by sacrifice, but something inherent, quiet, and steady. Like the earth beneath her hands, holding everything without needing to be thanked. As evening fell, Clara curled on the couch with a novel and a soft blanket. Rain whispered against the windows. She turned pages slowly, savoring every word. There was no urgency, no one needing her attention, no guilt pressing like a stone on her chest. Just stillness. And in that stillness, she felt something unfamiliar bloom, contentment. It wasn't loud or dazzling, but it was whole. It wrapped around her like the blanket on her shoulders, warm and complete. Weeks passed like that, quiet, steady, full. Clara found herself laughing more at work, lingering at the pottery studio afterward to shape lopsided bowls she proudly carried home. She met friends for dinner, stayed up too late talking about books and movies, let herself enjoy the small absurdities of life. She wasn't performing usefulness anymore. She was simply living. The difference was profound. It was like she had stepped out of a cage she hadn't known she was inside. One afternoon, she saw her reflection in a shop window as she walked downtown. She almost didn't recognize herself. Her shoulders were no longer hunched. Her eyes were bright, curious. She wasn't weighed down by invisible debt or quiet resentment. She stood straighter, not because anyone was watching, but because she finally believed she was enough. She smiled at her reflection, and for once, it smiled back. She passed a bridal boutique on her way home. White gowns floated like ghosts behind the glass. For a fleeting moment, she imagined Sophie in one of them, laughing, spinning, her pigtails replaced by a sleek updo. The thought didn't hurt. It was just distant like a photograph in someone else's album. Clara whispered, "Be happy, wherever you are," and kept walking. It wasn't bitterness. It was release. That night, she lit a single candle on the dining table and ate dinner by its glow. The house was silent, but not lonely. She thought about all the years she had tried to be indispensable, thinking it would earn her love. Now she knew the truth. Love isn't proof of worth. Worth is what remains even when love leaves the room. And hers had never left. It had just been waiting for her to notice. Clara rinsed her plate, turned off the light, and walked softly down the hall. She paused at her bedroom door, looking back at the house one last time. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was hers, entirely.